Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Unchurned. I'm Josh Schachter. I'm the founder and CEO of UpdateAI. Joining me today is Alice Jeffery. Alice is based out of the UK. She is a manager of customer success teams at Mimecast. Mimecast is a major cybersecurity company. They were founded in 2003. They've got over 40,000 customers. They went public and then recently went back private, which is interesting. And they have around 90 CSMs on their team. So really excited to be chatting with Alice. Alice is a listener of Unchurned, reached out to me about a topic that was very near and dear to her heart that she thought others could find value in, and I agreed. And so we're on this podcast today. So Alice, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Josh, for having me.
So the topic we're going to talk about is emotionality. And I want to get into that in one moment. But first, I want to learn a little bit more, warm up a little bit, learn a little bit more about you and about Mimecast. So for those that, are not hip to cybersecurity as much as they might be hip to TikTok and other types of quote unquote sexier applications, what does Mimecast do? Because you guys are a major company, a major player.
Yes, absolutely. So for anybody who maybe hasn't heard of us or they're not aware of what we do, essentially Mimecast is here to support good organizations battling against cybercrime, cyber attacks, and make sure they're working with what we call work protected. So if we think that as the landscape of cyber threats has evolved and changed, and you'll see lots in the news recently about, say, cyber attacks that have come out into this space, it's our job to make sure that we're supporting our customers with the latest and greatest technology to ensure that the important work that they're doing is well protected. And that could be from email security, brand protection, data resiliency, for example. So there's a number of areas that we dip into. So for anybody who hasn't heard of us, it's essentially to ensure that we are assisting good organizations to protect themselves from the nasties that are out there.
For anybody that hasn't heard of you, maybe they're just not secure. Maybe they're just not protected. They need to be.
Yeah.
So why is cybersecurity so hot right now? What gives? Because I hear more and more about it every day. What's going on?
Great question. Well, I think it's quite a scary place where the availability of, say, malicious software or malware, as we call it, is becoming a lot more readily available. And there is a lot of uncertainty at the moment in the global space, as we've seen with the pandemic and with politics and economics, for example. And so, unfortunately, the landscape is rife for people to take advantage of that. And so, realistically, we have a podcast ourselves at Mimecast called Fishy Business. Anybody who's interested, please feel free to tune in. And we speak to huge amounts of thought leaders in our space from a variety of different areas in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a really, really broad topic. And on speaking with them, they are all in agreement that unfortunately, it's not a case of if you're going to be attacked nowadays, but when. And that's quite a scary prospect. And so cybersecurity is really hitting the front page of the news to make sure that companies are protecting themselves and having the resiliency they need to make sure that they are buffering against the latest born threats and cyber actors. So it's increasing in popularity. I think a lot more people are taking it very, very seriously nowadays. It doesn't matter if you're big or small. Realistically, everybody is a potential target. And because of the situation that we're in, with a lot of uncertainty that's going on in the globe at the moment, then also brought in with the availability of malware now on a mass scale, that is creating a recipe where cybersecurity is becoming a headline news.
Yeah, it is really important. And this was always your dream. I mean, when you were a little girl in England, it was mom, dad, I want to work for a cybersecurity company when I grow up, right?
Well, funnily enough, I'm actually a linguist by trade. which meant that I am very chatty and I love talking to a wide variety of different people. And you're probably thinking, well, how does that relate back to cybersecurity? But I think also when I was very little, I used to love the Disney films with good versus evil and good being triumphant, for example. And as I came through my career, through university, came out of university, I think that really carried with me. And a big priority of mine was to utilize my languages. I actually looked at going into the military initially to utilize my languages. Unfortunately, personal circumstances meant that couldn't happen. And so I discovered and kind of happened upon Mimecast in the cybersecurity space, and it really interconnected those core fundamentals that were really important to me. I could utilize my languages. Obviously, cybersecurity is in the global space, in the global realm. I was able to utilize my languages. Mimecast was able to actually give me the opportunity to work in Germany for a number of years, which was an amazing opportunity. But then also with that prospect of that good versus bad, helping those good organizations to really combat anything that may be trying to attack them from the perimeter. So it also kind of lives to my sort of childhood insights into that good versus evil, and good being hopefully triumphant at the end of the day. So it's been fantastic working for Mimecast, working with our customers to really help them combat that.
Cool. So we're going to talk about emotions. Before we do that, quickly, what's the setup of customer success at Mimecast? I mean, it's a firewall. It's a security company. You don't need relationships, right? Prove me wrong. In short order, how do you guys operate CS?
Great question. Well, I think when you come to platforms like Mimecast, we say that we are dealing with our main product is dealing with email, which is the number one business critical infrastructure for most businesses. And hence there's a lot of emotion running behind that. When customers want to increase their cybersecurity or their security stance, for example, that's quite a big step for them to take, because they are interacting with such an important infrastructure within their business. And so the customer success managers are really there to be that human element, to understand that can be scary for customers. We deal with it on a day-to-day basis. We are the experts in this space. Our customers may not be. And so it's really important to have that human element there, to really have that understanding, that empathy, and to work with them to understand the customer's goals and ensure that they get there and they receive that value, essentially. So I would say from a customer success perspective, for us being there, we can support our customers with that journey and hopefully alleviate some of that maybe nervousness to implement the product and get the best value out of it by guiding them along that journey, essentially.
And emotion comes into play. Where did your interest in emotions in business come from?
Great question. So it was funny, actually. It was with a previous company. I was actually in sales. I was on the dark side. And I was speaking with a fellow colleague who was taking over from me. I was handing over a few accounts to them. And I was just saying to him, it's really important to understand the emotional reasons behind why a customer has purchased the product. I think we've all learned it through customer success, customer facing, sales training, that emotion is really important in business. And he responded to me to say, but we're dealing with banks. We're in financial services. There's no emotion behind why they've bought the product. And I knew that wasn't technically true, but I didn't have the answer to go back to him to convince him that emotion is really important in business, no matter what industry you're dealing with, no matter what companies you might be working with. And I was really frustrated at myself that I didn't have an answer to go back to him. And essentially that created a huge research project that's led me to today to ultimately have an answer to that statement.
Tell us about that research project. Well,
we actually had a host of what we call Mime Talks. So they're kind of based off of the TED Talks. And I got the opportunity to apply, and I wanted to share my story essentially with the wider company, and that supported my research. And I kind of stumbled across a book called Rewire Your Anxious Brain by Catherine Pittman and Elizabeth Carl. And it was interesting because I wasn't necessarily reading that book to look into emotion in business, but there's a huge amount of information in there that I think really supports this argument that I was trying to create, essentially. And the information that they provide you is around how your brain is wired, essentially. And so if we look at the biological signs of that, within the brain, there are two key fundamental parts that we need to understand for this particular topic, which are our amygdala, which are two small almond-shaped sections within the brain, roughly in the center towards the lower end, and then also our cortex at the front. And they're both really important for us to gain an insight into, because I'm a big believer of knowledge is power, being the daughter of two teachers. gaining as much knowledge as we possibly can. I think if we really understand how these two pieces of the brain work from a customer facing perspective, then I think we can start to look into customer success more as an art form. We can utilize that information and harness it to really prepare ourselves when we're interacting with customers. So if we take a look at the amygdala, essentially what that section of the brain is doing is controlling our emotions. Now, to my colleague's point, when he talks about there is no emotion in business, we're dealing with banks. Ultimately, the amygdala's job is there for survival. So it's right back from prehistoric ages when humans were cavemen, for example. Your amygdala was there to make sure that you survived. So if you had a bear chasing you, for example, it will release adrenaline and cortisol and heighten your senses. And it brings on this fight or flight syndrome that we look into. And then your cortex, your cerebral cortex at the front of the brain, what everybody kind of thinks of when they think of the brain, that's where the logical side of the brain functions. And so what I delved into and what you read in, say, the Rewire Your Anxious Brain, or there's other scientists, psychologists that do a lot of research into this as well, is that the amygdala has the ability to shut down other parts of the brain. So if you think where the section where we are controlling emotion, depending on how heightened our emotions are, actually the amygdala has the ability to shut down, say, the logical side of the brain.
The amygdala has an override basically for the rest of the brain. It's got that emergency shut off switch for the whole brain.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And when people talk about, oh, just switch the emotions off, just take the emotions out of it, from an actual biological perspective, that is physically impossible to be able to do that, because the amygdala is wired in such a way that it has the ability to basically be an off switch for other sections of the brain. It's an incredibly powerful part of the brain.
Yeah. But I assume, and maybe we'll talk about this later, that you can't shut off your amygdala, but maybe train it or train yourself to accommodate it, perhaps.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really good point that you raised there, Josh, because it's really important for us to have our self-awareness first and to understand when our amygdala is being triggered, because then when we're in a customer environment, we can then spot when the amygdala is being triggered on the customer side of things as well. So yeah, it's really important to have that self-reflection first and foremost to then allow us and enable us to really harness that when we're dealing with customers as well.
It's interesting because you hear, I've heard from a lot of coaches, make sure to label your emotions. Just the nature of labeling an emotion reduces its impact on you. Which I guess makes sense. If you're not able to override the amygdala, if you can't override those emotions entirely, at least the self-awareness of that's taking place is one way to temper it. Yeah.
I think also what really resonates with me around how the amygdala is so powerful, it controls our emotions, it can control other parts of the brain, is that I've seen it in action. And when we think about survival and the reason why the amygdala exists in the first place, I was actually hit by a car when I was 13. And from the injuries that I sustained, we're aware that as the car was approaching to come and hit me, my body fainted, which now we understand actually allowed me to survive that incident. And since the research that I've been doing into the amygdala, into how it controls our emotions, but how it controls other sections of the brain, our body as well, actually what I found is that it was my amygdala that saved me. Because what happened was when it realized I was in this survival mode, I wasn't getting out of the way of the car anytime soon, it essentially shut down the rest of my body to give me the best ability to survive that incident as much as possible. And so I think that's given me a real keen interest and passion into researching this topic and understanding the power that the brain has in these interactions, and also how it relates to customer success and customer facing roles as well, because actually I've seen the power of the amygdala working in action.
And you honor it. You acknowledge and appreciate it for what it serves you, right? It serves to protect you, just like it served to save your life in many ways.
And if we look at its interaction with the cerebral cortex, or the cortex right at the front of the brain, that relationship that they have is also really interesting. And we can relate that back to customer facing roles as well, where if you imagine if my logical side of the brain had taken over in that instance, the logic through my senses, through my eyes, my ears, sense of smell, would be looking at that car going, oh, great Mercedes. Oh, the driver in that Mercedes, yeah, he's got blonde hair and he's got a blue sweatshirt on, for example. And it would be taking in all of this information and digesting it. And actually, when we look at the wiring of the amygdala as well, which is really important to understand, information is actually fed through to the amygdala first and foremost, and then it reaches our cortex where the logical information is stored at a secondary level. And so what happens then is we are wired and created in such a way that the amygdala has the ability to step in first and shut down the body responses before logic then comes to step in, because essentially it doesn't want to waste that time when it's in survival mode. And so I think that's probably quite a good understanding of that story, is that why the logic has been shut down in the first place.
That's interesting. And it also then helps me understand why when you have a traumatic event, you often don't remember the details of that event. And it's probably because all your brain power is going to the amygdala, to the emotionality of things, and not to the surface level details, like you said.
And you raised such a good point there as well, Josh, because the amygdala also stores emotional based memories. And we can come into this slightly later, but when we think about a customer facing realm and emotion and heightened emotions that could be created during an interaction with, say, a vendor, you might have an escalation with a customer, they're frustrated, for example. The emotions from that scenario are stored in the amygdala, and essentially they are stored for much longer than informational based memories that are stored in, say, the logical side of the brain. And so that's why a lot of people may not remember specific details about a scenario, but they maybe get a sense that this scenario is going to be bad, or say a negative experience for them. And it's because of previous historic situations that they might have been a part of that have been stored as emotional memory within the amygdala. They can't remember the details of that experience, but they just remember that it was negative. And that's important for us to understand from a customer facing perspective.
So speaking of scenarios, you run a team of CS managers. Let's take a scenario here. I'm the customer. I'm talking to you, the CS manager. I'm pissed off. You're frustrated. You've had a long taxing day. Both of our emotions are running high, and maybe mine are rubbing off a little bit more. They're a little higher. You have this insight into into the neuroscience of our brains and emotions. So what? Practically, how does this help us in our roles facing customers?
Absolutely. And funny enough, it's a topic that we talk about as a team on quite a regular basis. So if you imagine you as the customer, you're seeing red, you are absolutely livid, your frustration is at an all-time high. If we understand as customer facing individuals what's happening in the brain of that person at the time, I think first and foremost, it helps us not to take that situation personally and allows us to remain on a calmer level. So we put a reason in there basically to understand that what's happening to this person is likely what we call an amygdala hijack, termed by the amazing psychologist Daniel Goleman when he talks about emotional intelligence. But what essentially happens there is the logical side of the brain is completely shut down at that time. So we can't reason logically with rationale to that person because their logical side of the brain isn't kicking in at that point. Their amygdala has completely taken over. So when we understand that about that person, again, we're putting reason in that scenario. So it helps us to justify, okay, that person's really frustrated. Logical rationale is not going to support them in this scenario. How can I react to that person to help diffuse the situation?
Yeah, that makes sense. And how do you calm down an irate customer using this knowledge?
Great question. Well, it's kind of, we call it a game that we play in our team. So I find that some people may not be competitive, but often people are competitive against themselves as a minimum. They want to do their personal best. So in this game, we imagine the customer's frustration on a scale of 1 to 10. And likely they're probably at, say, an 8 or a 9 at this point. And they're really, really frustrated, really livid. You might be the third or fourth person that they've spoken to on that day or on that week, for example. And our job is to bring that customer down that scale of frustration to as low as we possibly can. And so when we have that understanding of how the brain works, their logical side of the brain's been shut down, their amygdala has been taken over. Again, as I mentioned earlier, logical rationale is not going to work in this situation. So what we can do from our perspective, let's control our controllables. Let's focus on our voice, on our tone, on our pace, the words that we're using with that customer. And often what we find is if we're calm and we're focusing on ourselves, so it stops us from taking the situation personally, from rising to that frustration level with the customer. If we then stay calm and empathize with that customer as well, and to say, I can completely understand how this is impacting you right now. If I were in your shoes, I can completely see where you're coming from. And looking to lower them down on that scale. And what you'll find is if we focus on ourselves and, as I say, on our tone of voice, the words that we're using, that customer will gradually start to come down that scale, and you can feel it. You can hear it in their tone of voice. You can hear it in the words that they're using as well. And they come to meet you on that scale of a 1 to a 2. And it's such a rewarding feeling afterwards when you've got them down to the bottom of that scale. And as I say, a lot of our team members use it if they are speaking to an irate customer, and it just really helps diffuse. And then what happens there is the amygdala starts to subside, and then the logical part of the brain starts to come back into action. And this is physically happening within them. Most people won't even know it's happening. So I'm sharing the secret, essentially. And so the logical brain starts to kick back in. And this is where we can use rationale. And then we can use logical reasoning with that person, because we've been able to calm down the amygdala and allow their logical side of the brain to kick back in.
I love that. So that those biomechanical ways that you can help bring down the level of energy in the conversation. You know, it's funny. A dog trainer actually told me once that the word gentle, when you say that to a dog, right? When my puppies have been grasping a little bit too strong, saying that word actually triggers calmness, just the way the auditory experience comes out of gentle, right? There's probably some scientific name for that, but it just reminded me as you were talking about the different techniques of bringing down the conversation. So,
absolutely.
What if you actually can't empathize? Like you could, of course, you can fake empathy, but if it's not natural, if you don't really understand the shoes that the other person is in, how can you relate to that person to calm the situation?
It's funny you ask, because I think if you'd have asked me this probably a few years ago, or, you know, even maybe 10 years ago, I would say I'm instinctively an empath. I feel what other people feel. And so to have heard, you know, what if you just can't empathize? I think I probably would have thought, you can't empathize with somebody? How can you not empathize with somebody? But actually, I found myself in this situation with my husband one day when I was saying to him, well, how would you feel if you were in that person's situation? And he turned around to me and he said, well, I've never been in that situation, so how would I know? I thought, that's very interesting. And through the Mimecast talks, as I say, the TED-like talks that we did at Mimecast a few years ago, that really stuck with me. And I was thinking about that, and it was niggling at me. And I thought, God, how can you give somebody a tool that will help see the other person's situation if they are not a natural empath? And so what I came up with was, you know, you'll hear it from parents, grandparents, people say, oh, well, how would you feel if you were in that person's shoes? And I switched that around slightly to, instead of how would you feel if, you change it to how did you feel when? And the key there is the feeling that you can relate to that person. Because to my husband's point, if you've never been in the same situation as somebody else that they're experiencing at that moment, that can be quite hard to empathize with that person. But we all share the same feelings. And so I think the real key with that is, if you have somebody who's really frustrated, asking yourself, when I was really frustrated with, and we've all had it, we've all worked with, say, delivery companies, or we've ordered a new television and it hasn't arrived on time, or we've ordered, say, for example, a new table and we've got guests coming round in 2 days' time and it's going to be a week delayed and we're saying, we need it right now. We've all been there where we felt frustrated or irate, or we've hit a brick wall and somebody isn't there to support us. And so if we change that sentence to how did you feel when, and then we look into the feeling that person is experiencing, like frustration, like anger, like stress, for example. We've all had stress in our jobs. We can all definitely relate to that. That then helps us understand, okay, actually, I can relate to that person. I can meet them on their level because I've shared that feeling at some point or other. And I know it feels terrible to be in that feeling, in that emotion. But actually, the situation that they're in doesn't really matter. It's the feeling that they've got that we can then relate to.
Yeah. Love that. Alice, thank you so much for being here today. Didn't expect to learn so much about the human brain, but really welcomed it and was delighted for that experience. I want you to leave us with a final quote, something that you had told me last time we spoke a few weeks ago. And it really stuck with me. And I actually bought it, a print of it, and put it up on my office wall. So tell us more.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Josh. And thank you very much for having me. And yeah, I think something that really sticks with me is, firstly, it's not about B2B or B2C. It's P2P, people to people. And a quote that I found from an amazing lady over in the States, Maya Angelou, is, people will forget what you said and they'll forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.